I traveled to a small town in Germany named Rudesheim. When I first arrived there by taxicab, I could feel some kind of sickness in the air, and to this day I can't explain it. But something about that feeling made this sleepy little town seem a little off. Despite such feelings, it was a beautiful Sunday afternoon, and all the coffee shops were filled with more camera-wielding tourists than residents. Earlier that month, I had received a letter from one of my old colleagues. In the letter, it told me of a story he had come across. An old Nazi concentration guard that went into hiding wanted to tell his story. The letter didn't give me much to go on in terms of what his tale was about, but it piqued my curiosity, and the next thing I knew, I was paying the cab driver and turning to look up at an old white and black building. Hanging from the side of the building was an old wooden sign. Written on the surface was Kaffee und Kuchen. I had received instructions via telegram that I was to meet Mr. Mueller inside Kaffee und Kuchen. I walked inside, past the pastries that gleamed in the window sunlight, strode by a few old folks that were seated by the window, who gave me odd looks, and as I reached the counter, a heavy-set man with a white mustache and beige baker's apron, with a name tag on his breast pocket that read Hans Dietrich, stood up from his wooden stool and spoke to me in German. I followed the instructions and gave him the password that was scribbled in the letter. Sanguine. He let me through, and I followed him to the back. We got to the end of the room, and he turned and told me to stop as he lifted the carpet off and revealed a hidden trap door. He opened it. The dust tumbled off as the hinges whined in agony, wanting to be bathed in oil. Schnell, he whispered. I stepped into the darkness, and what little light was left was engulfed by the blackness as he shut the trap door. I heard him haul the rug over the door, and he walked away. I made my way down the steps, running my fingers along the stone wall as it twisted, until I almost lost my balance at the end of the stairs. At the end of the small hallway was a flicker of light. I slowly walked towards the light and entered a musty-smelling room. The light itself came from a lantern which was seated on top of an old wooden table, and behind the lantern was an ancient-looking man. His skin was pale, his white hair in wisps, but his eyes were alive, ablaze in the light. He smiled at me and offered me to take the seat across from him. I sat down and looked at my surroundings. Aside from the two of us and this little table, there wasn't much. There was a smaller room in the back which housed a small toilet and bath. To my right was a sink, a mini fridge, and a small cozy pantry. Behind him, along the wall, were links of sausages hanging on hooks.
I am so very glad you could come at such short notice, Herr Chaplin. I've heard quite a lot about you and how you specialize in paranormal journalism.
His German accent was crisp, just like those Hollywood movies which portrayed Nazis. He had the look of a 1,000-year-old piece of leather, but his voice sounded much younger.
I know I am going to die soon. I can feel death's creeping hands around my throat, waiting to strangle me. I need to tell someone with note about what happened in the summer of 1945.
I took out my notebook. I flipped through the filled pages with flashes of words jumping out at me.
It was a few months before the Allies crushed the Axis. The once unstoppable Hitler was soon to be destroyed.
He spat on the floor.
I hated that man and everything he ever brought to the great nation of Germany. I was at first drawn to his beautiful speeches of uplifting our country from ashes. I started to wear the famous swastika as a symbol of a hopeful future. Yet as soon as I started to see what he really was planning, the more and more I resented ever joining the military. I'd done a great deal of bad things, but I like to think by helping all the poor people in the concentration camp, it somehow helps move my soul to a better place.
What bad things did you do?
Hitler was rounding all the Jews together. My orders were strict and to the point. We were all to bring the Jewish community and populace to camps. He had told my squad that there was a traitorous spy among the people, that in order for Germany to become once again a stable superpower, we couldn't let any spies reveal our plans to begin anew.
Did you find it strange that he was targeting the Jewish folk?
Of course I did.
He stood up and walked to the fridge and brought out a glass jar of milk, 2 cups from the cupboard, and a tray of small sandwiches. I grabbed a few and ate.
I knew something was wrong. I knew that. But did I do anything? Did I ask my commanding officer what the end game was? Nein. I was too afraid. I knew how the SS officers worked, and I was terrified that if I was pushing for answers, that they would grow suspicious.
He drank from the cup.
So I kept my mouth shut, put the Jews on the cargo trains, and prayed for their souls.
He sighed. For a moment, the youthfulness in his eyes faded.
It wasn't until I was pulled from peon rank and placed at a higher one and shipped to one of these camps, that's when I knew I had done terrible, terrible things.
You must have known about the concentration camps and what was really happening in them.
Not with my squad. Hitler's army was very secretive. He didn't even trust his own council, let alone some lowly ranked random soldier. In your history books, all those appalling concentration camps are listed, but one that your American schools refuse to put in their books is Die Forschung concentration lager, the outer beyond concentration camp. It was Hitler's pride and joy.
He took a bite out of his sandwich. He looked like a mouse trying to eat something 4 times its size.
It was June 17th, 1945. It was midday, and the sun was out blasting us in force. I was part of the 4th Jager, Hunter Division. My tasks were to watch the prisoners and make sure that they were not trying to escape.
You said before that these camps were appalling. If you felt so strongly towards them, well, why didn't you just leave?
Just leave? That, my dear boy, was out of the question. If I was to leave, the SS would ask me a great deal of questions, like where I was from, where my family originated, what business I had that was so important that I had to shove aside Die Führer's plans, and how it is that I gained such a position in the camp.
He sipped from his cup. He set it down with a clank and gave me a heavy stare.
I am a Jew.
I looked at him, wondering if he was deranged or telling the truth.
Now, you can see why I could not afford unwanted suspicions. Not only ill-favored for myself, but also for my wife and baby back in Frankfurt.
I see. How did you manage to keep this a secret?
In World War I, my father and most of the town's able-bodied men left to fight in the war. What was left were sickly old people, a few young women, including my mother, and the rest were just children, just old enough to wipe their own noses. When the war ended, we waited for my father and the men to come back. They never arrived. Luckily for us, the thing we did encounter was the collapse of the economy, and with it, food became scarce, even for us farmers. Most of the people that lived in that little village died of starvation in the first 6 months. All the animals were hunted, all the crops were bleak and rotted, and the water had begun to taste sickly sweet. My mother took my brother and my younger sister and myself to Berlin. Long story short, my brother died on the way there of pneumonia, and once we reached Berlin, my mother found work, which one thing led to another, and now here I sit. The point is, the small farming village and its inhabitants, aside from my mother and sister and I, had died. No one knew who we were, and as far as anyone was concerned, we were just a family looking to survive, just like the rest of the country was.
He sighed, smiling.
My mother was a smart woman. She used to work in a small bakery, the very same one that is over your head. After such a defeat, some folks was spreading rumors of how it was the Jews that did us in. More and more people started to pour in, listening to his sermon of misguided hate. Some nodding their heads in approval, while most spat in disgust. My mother decided it was best that we all change our names. She knew something was boiling and didn't want us to get burnt. My name was once Hugo Rugheimer. My mother changed it to Hugo Mueller. A simple yet efficient change from a Jewish to German name.
He rubbed the joints in his hands.
That's how I was able to pass unnoticed for so many years. And it's because of my mother's actions that I was able to help so many in that camp.
How so?
The SS officers and the other Jäger always gave scraps of food to the Jewish people. They fed their dogs better meals than they did those poor souls. There were days when I would starve myself just to be able to give the children a little bit of nourishment. Danke, they would whisper to me. I was disgusted in myself. Being a guised specter among so much evil took a toll on my mental stability. What I saw done to those poor people has haunted me for so many years.
What did you see happen to them?
There was a laboratory headed by Franz Zimmermann, an occult scientist that had been trying to find a gateway into another world, or so the talk amongst the barracks went. From what I heard, his theory was to create portals so that the Germans could access them across Europe and destroy all whom opposed in a matter of seconds. It sounded like some sort of children's science fiction tale. Yet the more I followed up on leads, overhearing officers speak, the more I realized it wasn't as far-fetched as I had once thought.
He got up from his wooden chair and walked towards a sweater which was hanging on one of the hooks. He placed the sweater around his shoulders and cocooned himself.
On my rounds, I would begin to notice a short man that resembled Hitler, except for the fact that this man was shorter, fatter around the face, and wore glasses. Both of the officers saluted him and spoke his name, Heinrich Himmler. He was Hitler's right hand, and the one that oversaw Franz's work. Later that night, I was doing my rounds. I was walking down alongside the barbed wire under the shadow of the moon, and with my uniform I was completely invisible. I started to hear muffled screaming coming down from where I was. I slowly crept toward the sound, turning a few building corners until I saw Franz Zimmermann's lab. There were 6 guards pushing along at least a dozen people in a single file up the steps. Some were crying, others were quiet, while some looked to be in another world, possibly a world they created in their minds just to escape.
Did you know what was happening to them?
I hadn't the faintest idea, but for the rest of the night I heard screams coming from the lower halls of the lab. I never cried when my father hadn't come back from the war, but I did cry myself to sleep, knowing these people were having horrific things done to them, and knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it. A few weeks later, I was promoted to laboratory guard. It was Himmler's idea to promote those who kept the Jews calm. How sadistically ironic of him. The first night at the laboratory, and already they had Jewish folk being brought into the building. For weeks, Jews were marched into the building only to be taken down to the lower levels. Franz had been doing something terrible for them to be screaming like that. That was one of the worst parts of that place, knowing they were dead. The sheer silence that came after gave me night terrors. One of the normal guards was sick, so I was tasked with bringing the new group of poor souls to the lower levels. It took everything I had to prevent myself from crying. As I walked past the cages, pleading hands were reaching out towards me. They were all screaming in whispers, "Tot mich bitte. Kill me, please," they pleaded.
He started to tear up a bit. Then, as if remembering something, his face grew to a pitch of anger.
The other guards in front of me laughed, slapping their hands away. Some kicked their hands, breaking fingers, and sometimes arms. My anger was boiling. Franz stood there with his leather apron, face mask, and surgeon's gloves. He told us to put the mice into the chamber. We did as ordered, while the others laughed. I closed my eyes and prayed for them. As we turned and were about to walk out, Franz stopped us. He told us that since we were new, that we needed to have a lesson in secrecy. We walked out of the room and shut the door. He gently raised his hand and waved for us to look into the room through the glass window. The people we had put into the room were looking around, speaking in German, our language, something that Schwein Franz failed to see. I watched as they were hopelessly looking around, most were crying and hugging each other. Franz started to laugh as he pushed a few buttons, turned a few more knobs, and pulled down a metal rod. The little slits around the room started to open up. The people inside were curious, but all huddled together. They placed the children in the middle of the elderly while the young surrounded them. I
He broke off, beginning to cry.
These white tubular worms started to crawl from under the slits. At first, it was a few, and then they started to spill out like cockroaches, swarming their way towards their prey. The people inside started to scream as the worms grew closer. One of the men jumped from the group and into the corner. He lost his footing as he slipped on the white, milky worm. As he fell, the worms washed over him like a wave. He started to scream. The worms were burrowing their way into his skin. The more he screamed, the more they jumped in, oozing their way down his throat, until all that he managed were gargles. And his body began to seize up and shake uncontrollably. Everyone else in the room began to scream. They pressed against the side of the chamber as far away as they could. The other guards cheered and laughed. Some clasped Franz on his shoulder in excitement. They slowly turned away. When they asked if I enjoyed the show, I reluctantly smiled and nodded. Peered into the room once more and saw that the people who had been standing were now engulfed in squirming tubular-like worms. In the middle of the room was a small child. His eyes were red from crying. The worms, finished with the others, surrounded the small child in a circle. And as soon as he and I locked eyes, the worms jumped on him, and he fell to the ground. I ran to the sink and started to puke. The men laughed and called me a woman. I didn't give a shit what they thought of me.
He wiped his eyes with his sleeve.
It was in that moment, when I was looking down at my puke, that I snapped. I knew I had to do something, to at least try and save my fellow Jews. Even if I died, I would die knowing I attempted. For the following weeks I planned, marking the patrol routes of the guards, mapping out where the keys were, and who held them at what hour. I made detailed mental lists of the things Franz did. The more I watched him, the more I hated him.
He tapped his fingers on the table.
It was August the 4th. It was late in the night. Most of the guards were asleep by now. I made my way to the barracks. Clutched in my hands was my father's hunting knife. I had been sharpening it every day until that night. I crept into the barracks and started putting pillows over the men's faces, stabbing until nothing but feathers and splashes of red. I left the barracks and made my way to the guardhouse. One of the men had his feet propped up on the table while he spoke to the other man. The man that was in front of him was looking out the window. I slipped into the room, slicing the sitting man's throat. He clutched at his gaping wound as I smiled at him. I walked towards the other man, kicked his leg out, and stabbed him numerous times in the chest, covering his mouth with my hands to muffle the noise. I slipped back out from the metal shack and made my way up to the muddy path. Two Nazis were walking with their backs turned the other way. I crouched and walked towards them as fast as I could. I kicked the leg from the one in the back and sliced his throat. The other man turned and saw me. He was about to scream until I threw my knife. It wedged itself between his eyes. After clearing the camp of all the Nazis, I made my way to Franz's laboratory.
He sighed. If you need to take a break, that's okay.
Don't be silly, Derek. I did not have you come out here just to wait for an old fool like me.
He smiled, but it was hollow, his face wrinkled with sadness that was too strong to be kept back by a simple smile.
I opened the door to the building and was greeted by 2 SS officers. One of them was about to ask me what I was doing there, I'm sure of it, until he saw my uniform covered in red. He pulled out the Luger pistol, but was too late. I lodged my knife into his hand and he dropped the gun and started to scream. The other officer was too slow with his reaction, because before he knew it I had pounced on his, slamming his head into the wall until it was nothing but a broken mess. I walked over to the officer that was clutching his hand, yanked the knife out and stabbed him repeatedly. Something had overcome me that night. It was a certain bloodlust that needed to be quenched. I killed the remaining officers in the building and made my way down to the lower levels of the lab. I found Franz listening to classical music while operating on a cadaver. His back was turned to me, so I slowly walked towards him. He turned, his eyes the size of saucers, as he saw my blood-soaked attire. He screamed for help. I smiled at him and told him there was no help coming. He reached for his surgical knife. I punched him across his face, hitting his temple, knocking him out. I dragged his limp body into the chamber where I saw the boy. He was stirring awake as I walked out of the room. He awoke, flailing like a newborn calf. He realized where he was, his eyes wide. He pleaded with me to let him live.
He laughed a little.
He expected me to save his life after he murdered thousands of others in cold blood.
His hard stare came back.
The door behind me had closed. He ran up to it and started banging on it. I walked to the window and so did he. His voice was muffled behind the 4-inch thick sheet. He begged me, pleaded that I reason. There was no reasoning with monsters. I had seen my fair share of cruelty, but nothing that I had seen even compared to the small boy I saw in the room that night. I started to flip a few switches. He started to scream, 999! As I turned the last knob, he looked back at me, not saying a word. I spat on the ground and pulled the metal rod. Slits had opened up once more. The squirming sound erupted from behind the darkness. I watched as he screamed, looking for a way out. The more he screamed, the more the white worms were drawn towards him. He started to wail like a newborn babe, his eyes wide as the worms jumped into the air, slamming him into the ground, washing over him like a small white wave. His body started to contort and seize up. He started to shake. I watched with gleeful happiness as the monster of Franz Zimmerman died. In a loud pop, his body exploded, sprawled across the window where the worm-infested bloody chunks of Franz slowly sliding onto the ground. I ran into the room where the cages were. I slid the latches free. The people were crying, feebly trying to clutch me in an embrace. I needed them to get out. Once I had freed the prisoners, I grabbed all the gasoline tanks I could find and started a great fire. As I exited the building, the laboratory started to explode.
He nodded as if he were agreeing with himself.
I had gone back to the barracks and gotten the keys for the rest of the compound. I unlocked all the gates and doors. They all looked at me with uncertainty until one of the old women recognized me. "That's Helga's boy." She kissed me on the cheek 1,000 times. I heard crying mixed with laughter as they all chanted, "Hugo, Hugo, Hugo." I started to cry, apologizing for not doing something sooner. The men, women, and children all embraced me. It was such a surreal moment in my life. Seeing all their skinny faces filled with hope and joy. I found enough clothes to make sure they were all warm. I found crates of food that they consumed in matters of minutes, and in the end, myself and a few other brave men loaded everyone into big military convoy trucks. I had placed explosives around the encampment, and when we were at a safe distance, I detonated them. I watched as the camp exploded into a spectacle of orange light illuminating the darkness with each bang. It was a great feeling. The weight that had oppressed me for so many years had finally been lifted. I saved 348 people that day, and not a day goes by that I wish I had saved more. I walked over to one of the blazing fires and put the Nazi uniform into the inferno. It crinkled under the fire and I spat on it. I was glad the Allies had been pushing Hitler's Germany to the brink of ruin. So many Germans lived in fear, and so many died because of such anxieties.
He drank the remaining drops from his milk and took one last bite from his sandwich.
I may have saved quite a few lives, but in the end, I still can't save my own.
What do you mean?
In my old age, I will not die as Hugo Rugheimer, the poor boy from the small farming community village. I will die as Hugo Müller, the Nazi that guarded the research concentration camp. That is a cross only I can carry. I just hope that God will grant me mercy. My biggest sin in life was not saving enough people. That is the guilt I must wear, Herr Chaplain.
This is one of the saddest stories I've ever heard, Herr Rugheimer. I really don't know what to say.
You needn't say anything, my boy. You've given me something that no other human being could have.
Which is?
You've given me a small measure of peace.